Hello and welcome to LMD's panel discussion on wildlife. We're talking about the challenges as well as the strategies to protect, conserve and preserve Sri Lanka's animals. With me here today, I have a very eminent panel, and let me introduce them first. Of course, I have right next to me leopard expert Anjali Watson, who is the managing trustee at the Wilderness and Wildlife Conservation Trust. Anjali, welcome. And then, of course, we have senior conservationist Rukshan Jayewardene, who was the former director of Environmental Foundation and a founding trustee at the Leopard Trust, and of course, a past president of the WNPS. Welcome, Rukshan. And then, last but not least, we have someone who's no stranger to the topic, Sriyan Silva Wijeyeratne, former chairman of the WNPS and also current chairperson of PLANT, which is Preserving Land and Nature Guarantee. Welcome, Sriyan. To warm ourselves and to warm up our audience for the discussion to follow, Rukshan, I'm going to direct my first question at you. We always talk of how Sri Lanka, despite being a tiny island, has an abundance of biodiversity. But lately, we can't help but wonder whether our size is a boon or a bane when it comes to our animal species. Can you shed some light on the state of biodiversity in Sri Lanka today?
Yes, actually, what I'd like to say initially is that calling Sri Lanka a tiny island is a misnomer. Sri Lanka is a large island. Sri Lanka is the world's 24th largest island, by the way. So this is a listing that begins with the giant island of Greenland, which is almost 2.2 million square kilometers. Sri Lanka at 65,300 square kilometers becomes the 24th largest island in the world. So actually, if Sri Lanka was a tiny island, because this is a world that has hundreds of thousands of islands, we wouldn't have the biodiversity we have. We wouldn't have the megafauna we have. So in terms of countries, we are a small country. But in terms of islands, we are a large island. And we are a continental island. And so those characteristics of this island have created the environment and the diverse habitats to enable the biodiversity that we have. So, since Sri Lanka has a large population, human population is almost 22 million people, there is a lot of pressure on the land. And the loss of biodiversity is as a direct result of this. Human beings use up a lot of the landscape for living, for agriculture, for moving around. And so, for the biodiversity Sri Lanka has to survive, they have to survive in more or less intact landscapes. And those intact landscapes, or rather natural landscapes, are there because we allow them to be there. And that is where conservation comes into play, and a kind of network of national park sanctuaries, forest reserves. So most of these today are under threat from population pressure mainly. I say something more about that later, but it's the changing land use, the pressure of populations on the landscape and on biodiversity that is contained within. That is why this decline is happening. There are very many specifics, but generally you could say a substantial, a large island, but a relatively small country with a lot of population pressure on diverse habitats and fairly astounding biodiversity for the size of the island is now, we are feeling the impact, and a lot of species are therefore facing massive threats, and some are actually being pushed to extinction, especially the smaller species of animals and even plants.
Anjali, would you like to weigh in?
Just mentioned. One is the island notion that you talked about. Island biogeography in itself is a study, right? And having Sri Lanka being an island, it's an interesting role there, because you can almost look at it as a little laboratory, because it's closed in that sense. the species here have nowhere to emigrate out or in, right? So there's no that sort of thing outside of the landscape that we have. We have 65,000 square kilometers, and that's it in a sense that we would have to, look at. He also mentioned about it being a big country, 22 million people. But the interesting thing here, perhaps, is that how the people historically have lived on this island. And I think perhaps that's what's allowed us as an island, once again, to have so much biodiversity. Currently, it's, I think, still we're 75% rural, which is unusual for a big country like that, having 22 million people. So that, again, has its pluses and minuses, because our traditional ways of using the land, like our Candian home gardens, forest gardens, and so on, having cottage industries, not large-scale agriculture, allowing for human-wildlife coexistence, the religions that are on this island have allowed for this diversity that, thankfully we still have today. How that is changing now is really, as Rukshan also mentioned, what is perhaps going to impact us as an island and the species that live within it. How we choose to use that land. Do we move from our cottage industries, our traditional ways of farming and rearing cattle, to large scale? Then that's going to impact drastically. So then what happens is we're going to come into that biodiversity crisis. So that's, something to consider on an island. We mentioned we have large megafauna here too. Again, probably because they had the ability to move, to disperse, taking elephants or leopards, for example, wide-ranging large mammals. If that is cut up and stopped, then that's going to be a big thing. That's on the larger scale. If you look at a micro landscape, we may be removing habitats with intact species in them overnight. So from a blink of an eye, it's gone, and we don't even know that. So these are the changing things that I think perhaps we can all discuss today.
Thanks, Anjali. Sriyan, Anjali spoke of change, and Rukshan spoke of animals being pushed to the brink of extinction. How scary is this change? I mean, how fast are we? What is the speed we are looking at?
Well, unfortunately, the speed is, I would say, bringing the word exponential is relevant, because we are not seeing it getting any slower. It is heading in a direction which is unhealthy, worse, depending on which point of view you take, but certainly it's accelerating. And that's the worrying part. I might be at an odd here, but I would probably say the size of the country and the population, neither of those are a problem. So I think there is enough land space to manage the 22 million, although it's not ideal. We are more populated than many countries, but it's not this massive problem if you're applying a good management solution and a proper approach to this. Anjali spoke of our rich history and traditions and all of that. Unfortunately, the one thing that we are not rich in history and tradition is politics. We have, 70 odd years of experience in this current form of governance, and it's not ingrained and rooted on the things that make this country special. So it's charting courses for this country that maybe are, destroying many things that we've protected and preserved for centuries. So I'm a bit more of a view that it's a increasing problem. Species are declining and we are losing them at a rate. The red list is, blinking every day, but it's not an improbable, impossible kind of thing. If the right people are given the mandate, given the support, and there is a vision at the top to solve this, I think there's lots of room for coexistence for all these species.
It's actually a management problem. Sri Lanka has traditionally had a maldistribution of population. If you look at developers, they'll say this is a maldistributed population where most of every 3 out of 4 Sri Lankans live in the southwest quadrant of the island. So the dry zone areas, especially where a lot of megafauna exists still, has low population density. So, though we have a large population, there is an opportunity in the traditional way people have settled this land in recent centuries. So, to say that, well, this is the conservation challenges are not inevitable. Animals don't have to be pushed into extinction. Even the megafauna in Sri Lanka should be able to coexist with humans. And once again, agreeing with Sriyan, politics is the biggest stumbling block because political imperatives and political priorities are mostly at odds with conservation needs.
We set a nice stage for the conversation. Let's get into specifics, starting with cats. Anjali, I'm going to direct at you. So, Sri Lanka's apex predator and, for better or worse, one of the brand icons when it comes to tourism, talking about the leopard. Can you shed some light on the state of the Sri Lankan leopard today in terms of numbers, habitats? Because all what we are hearing mostly on the news is deaths and snares and traps. Can you shed some light on this?
So 3 points there to pick from what you just said. One is that it should be more than just a brand icon. It's in the recent years, I think that it's, being pushed like that for tourism. Obviously, it has its positives for that, but it also has negatives. I think many people now from the work that's been ongoing that we need to look at the leopard as being a possible landscape level conservation solution because it is the only wide-ranging large carnivore on this island, utilizing how it uses the land, how it moves across the landscape, and then using that as a proxy for landscape level conservation is how it should be, that's what we should be looking at right now, not just going and looking at a leopard in a national park and crowding it out. It's got a lot more than that when you want to see the value of that. Right? As far as numbers go, numbers, we always say it's one of those things, right? Everybody wants to know how much, but actually you will never know that answer. But sometimes, obviously, you do have to give a range. And so for now, and the last, possible census that occurs with these kinds of wide-ranging things, you can take smaller areas, small populations, where there is some form of extrapolation according to the forest habitat type and so on. So the current range, it's a big range for species like this. It goes from about 550 to 1,100 adults across the island. With like an 850 kind of number. But as we do more work, as we look at more specific areas across the island, it will change up, down, whichever way, it depends. It's a living species. You mentioned that, all we are seeing now is doom and gloom and snares and traps. So we've done a 20-year, 2-decade analysis with the DWC as well. And what we're seeing is there is an increase in human-induced mortality of leopards. So from the earlier decade of 2000 to 2010, we had about 4 deaths that we know of. And post-war, from 2011 to 2020, it's gone up to about 8. Right? And in the past 3 years, we've had 26 deaths, human-induced deaths that we know of. 75% of that is due to snares, and 75% of that is in the Central Highlands. But there's a lot going on in the dry zone that we don't know because it's not reported. Because traditionally, the dry zone is what has most of our, large wildlife. So there has been a lot more poaching in those areas, so it doesn't go reported. It also has the habitat type where, for example, a snared leopard can go and die and nobody would come across it other than the person who wanted it dead. Or even if they do come across it, they may not report for fear of, retail, whatever. So there is that, and we have to remember that, I think, which sometimes media doesn't remember, people don't remember, short memories humans have, is that there is a reporting bias. But having said that, obviously we are, from what we know, what is reported, what we're, data we're keeping, collectively, there is a slight increase.
You touched on this, but I'm going to also ask Rukshan to weigh in here. You spoke of how the leopard is more like an agent for landscape level conservation.
Yes.
What other benefits does this cat give us that we stand to lose if we lose them?
They do keep herbivore populations in check. In other words, why is it important for herbivore populations to stay in check in kind of limited numbers or in not increase in an uncontrolled manner? Because what happens when herbivore populations increase without any predator checks is that they overgraze their habitat, and then there can be catastrophic consequences for that population, where that population collapse, and also other species that rely on the plants that these herbivores graze on. Secondly, leopards keep herbivore populations streamlined. In other words, the sick and the weak are preyed on first, and also the landscape that might have more, because the leopard is not just a hunter, it's also a scavenger, and it cleans up carcasses that otherwise would rot and probably cause disease that can affect the population of species in that area. The leopard's presence is important for the prey species as well, though it sounds ironic. They need the leopard as much as the leopard needs them to survive.
Just to encapsulate that, there's 3 terms, right, that generally can be assigned to a wide-ranging carnivore like this, and that is what Rukshan just mentioned, is whether or not it is a keystone species. That comes from, we've said this many times, it comes from the concept of architecture where you have one stone at the top of the arch, you remove that, everything collapses, which is what Rukshan was just talking about, the herbivore populations being impacted. Whether or not that is here yet in Sri Lanka, we are not 100% sure, thankfully, because it means we'd have to actually remove the leopard to know that. Then the other concept is flagship species. So when you're talking about conservation, obviously, charismatic megafauna, as we've seen internationally and throughout the years, can hold that role for larger biodiversity conservation. And here in Sri Lanka, obviously the elephant, the leopard, the bear, those are our megafauna that can hold that role. And now more so, which I mentioned earlier about the landscape level, is the umbrella species concept. And it is now collectively well known, many studies have been done internationally, that as far as the cats go, the leopard stands absolutely supreme with holding that role as an umbrella species, where we can utilize it. So its numbers are much smaller, yet its impact is greater. So that's why the umbrella, where a lot of biodiversity below that umbrella, will also by default be protected if we focus conservation plans utilizing leopard movement in the landscape.
Anjali, you spoke of conservation plans. Earlier I was talking about doom and gloom, but I'm sure there's a lot of good news for us as well in terms of the work that has been put into leopard conservation. Can you share with us some of these plans in action?
Yes. So I think it's good to sometimes look on the positive side, keeping in mind, though, as Sriyan said, there is a lot of negatives that we also have to, realize. Probably one of the biggest changes, I was talking to Rukshan about this just before we started, is what we're seeing probably in the past 20 years of the fact that general civic society, even corporates, people are much more aware in a sense. Whether that is actually turning into action is left to be seen. We do see things like, I'm moving on to a different topic here now, but still from that conservation side, we do see where, earlier it used to be things like corporate social responsibility coming from the bigger entities. Now, thankfully, there's a change, and it's not just, throwing peanuts of some funds for some project and so on, but it's where people are realizing that it has to become intrinsic now, part of your actual structural plans. long-term work. Landholders and stakeholders in that sense are also realizing that. From a government perspective, I mean, 20 years ago when we first started work here, it was the elephant. Our entire national conservation plan was from the elephant's perspective. So now it's wider. It's including, a lot more. The planning units here are asking for more data. Ministries are utilizing more data. Then, of course, what happens beyond that is a whole different story. So there is a positive in that there is more movement, more people to push for it. There's a new generation of researchers coming up. And there's a new generation of general public. I mean, we're sitting here having this conversation, and I think there's a lot more of that. So many young people wanting to do, documentaries or hands-down work, volunteers and so on. Again, how that is used and how, unfortunately, as Sriyan mentioned, politically that, whether it gets used correctly or not at all and so on, then that is then how it would impact the future conservation of species here.
Thanks, Anjali.
2 points to this conversation, more from a WNPS perspective and about this whole thing of breeding new generations of researchers and public. So 2 things. One is about 3 years ago, the WNPS proposed to the DWC that we set aside a particular day for the Sri Lankan leopard. And that got accepted, and now we've had a couple of years of that early days, but we're using that date as an excuse to do a lot of storytelling around the impact the leopard creates on society, on tourism, and what would happen if we lose all that. So that's, new ways of publicizing this message. So that's one thing. The second thing I want to talk about is that WNPS also set up 6 research centers outside of the traditional locations that we were studying leopards, again, to kind of understand more about behavior, distribution, mortality, and so many other things. And these kind of things give opportunity for new researchers and general public, for people who would like to work on wildcats and leopards and things like that. Look up the WNPS Wildcats Committee. There's a lot of room for people to engage in actual conservation steps if they'd like to.
Sorry, Rukshan.
Cautionary to leopards living in human-dominated landscapes, not just in the hill country, but even in the dry zone, because there are many areas where leopards do live in areas that humans actually dominate the landscape. If the awareness, people have a fear psychosis and a threat perception of the leopard. And as more knowledge and more information goes out there about the presence of leopards in the landscape, sometimes people become aware of leopards in their landscape through media or through an incident that is covered by the media or becomes popular. And unless conservation organizations and the wildlife department, of course, can do enough attitudinal changes, to change people's attitude towards leopards and educate the public on the reality of living the coexistence of humans and leopards, the threat to leopards can actually increase. So, more knowledge simply does not mean more protection. The knowledge has to be carefully managed and disseminated, and the target groups have to get the right message. Otherwise, that old kind of fear psychosis is going to cause more leopard deaths than lessen it.
Can I just add to that? I 100% agree with what Rukshan is saying. Just working up in the hills, for example, since 2016, it's really a need-to-know basis that we need to consider things. All of the awareness work, even there, that we do, we don't talk about the leopard particularly. We talk about the system, the importance of montane zone forests, how those are the water towers for the rest of the island, how there's so much wildlife there. Even when we do, school programs and all, we never focus only on the leopard. If we do art competitions or drawings on their walls to get them a little bit more in tune with what's around them, it's always about what do you live with as opposed to that. Because as Rukshan clearly mentioned, there is that fear psychosis. And to be honest, sometimes the unseen, unknown, it's not a bad thing. It's not like we want to keep people down or anything of the sort. That's how coexistence does occur sometimes. That's why in the hills we find that the leopards are 90%, more than 90% nocturnal, because they themselves are avoiding. So comparative to our dry zone populations, especially in protected areas, the data shows that they themselves are far more nocturnal. And that's why they themselves are using the land in a different way, avoiding the human species. So that is a good thing that has occurred organically, naturally. So we mustn't attempt to change that in a way. So again, talking about a landscape level, the system itself, what lives within it, but not specifically focusing on something, is possibly the better way to go ahead. I mean, even for us, when we work with remote cameras throughout many landscapes, people want to come and take a look at what we're finding and so on. And sometimes they don't want to know there's a leopard right there where they walked, 15 minutes ago. So you have to be very careful in that sense. And I think that's something and also a shout out to the media here again. I always say this: over-reporting, incorrect reporting, reporting with sensationalism is not doing anybody any favors. Because you dramatize it, oh my God, these people are living in fear. But you actually talk to the people, and it's one person who's decided, they want their 5 minutes of fame and talk like this. Language is a big issue here. They say the leopard ate me, right? But that's just the terminology. Attack. It's actually a defense wound. We follow up all of these. You see that they're all defense wounds. So then the follow-up should be to explain that to the person. And when you do, they immediately realize, yes, I was not targeted. I am not being attacked in that sense.
Thank you, Anjali. Moving on to the other big topic when it comes to coexistence and cohabitation, the elephant. I mean, sometime back we heard that, an elephant was, more than the fair share of killings. I mean, it's a very ironic thing to say, happened this year, where we've seen like about 200, maybe more than that, you can correct me, of elephant deaths caused by humans. Can we talk about this a little bit? Because we have been coexisting with elephants for, centuries, or maybe more. But we still haven't learned how to do it properly. Sriyan, can we start this with you on how you see the situation as it is today?
Well, I think I'll refer to more last year's data, because this year's data, typically there is a lag in reporting, so the facts become clearer, but we've been seeing some very adverse trends. But here's a fun fact, because there's a lot of conversation, and there are two issues: the conservation of elephants, and then media seems to, the conversation gets dominated by treatment of some elephants, especially the captive elephants, and the Perahera conversation and the elephant right conversation. So here's a fun data point. Within just over the last year, more elephants were killed in Sri Lanka than the entire domestic elephant population in the country. In less than 2 years, more elephants died in Sri Lanka than the entire domestic elephant population in the country. Now, you don't see the people escalating this conversation in that proportion. So, similar to, let's say, some lives are more important than others, we have to reset this conversation to say, yes, animal cruelty, protection, all that is very important. But what's the bigger picture here? We are wiping out over 400 elephants a year. That's not okay. So I think there's a huge problem on our hands. Now, this is a well-documented issue. There have been discussions on this, policy papers on this, and sadly, there's positively, there is a accepted policy on saying how we are going to deal with this. Now, where we are now lacking is the will to say, yes, we will do what is needed to protect this. So we have all the data, the experts have weighed in, they've given their opinions on the elephant fencing and the other the steps we are taking. Some are miserable failures, some are better suited, some are unknown still. But there is knowledge if we are willing to practice. Where we are failing badly is the political will, as well as the self-discipline to kind of respect elephant corridors, balance the water supply during the dry seasons into, the different parks and the Webers and things like that. And then the punitive action. I mean, we cry about every tusker death, and it's reported we had one just days ago. But if you look at the outcomes of the punitive action taken against the poachers, the people who are responsible for the electrocution and all of that, none of these are adequate deterrents today to prevent that course of action. So I think we really need to step up our game if we want to come out on the other side. If not, we are dangerously close to, having a very sad outcome. And again, back to this earlier conversation, can we afford to have so many elephants? Can we manage this? I think there are many steps we should take first before trying to find the answer. Without taking those steps, if we simply conclude that we have too many elephants or something like that, that's probably a big mistake. And there's a lot of work to do. Sadly, too few people are trying to do it. And the broader people, then there's a set who will write about it, talk about it, and do nothing. And there's an entire powerful group who may not want the actual solution to be executed.
Can I weigh in on that? Sriyan mentioned about realigning how we look at things. In that same vein, and using existing data, there is research, there is science from Dr. Prithviraj Fernando's collective work with other people as well, is the realization that elephants, like leopards and many other species, live outside of our protected area system. And that realization, I think, needs to be heightened, because management cannot just be about within our protected areas. It needs to be more. We need to see how this interface is occurring. We obviously, I don't work directly with elephants, but from the data that's already there, like I mentioned, you see that there is a need for elephants to be able to move in and out of our agricultural areas, because after the paddy harvests are taken in, after the vegetable harvests are taken in, the fresh growth that comes, elephant populations feed on that, and that in and out movement is what has allowed Sri Lanka to have so many elephants. And this, I would say, is the same for many other species too. I mean, even leopards, right? They're not only in our national parks, as we know now. They live outside. So how do we then look at that as a holistic thing? That is the key, because if you look at even where the elephants are dying, how they are dying, why they are dying, it is more there. It is in that interface, in the outer areas where they need those areas to survive. So solutions then need to be, addressed there, and they're there. Solutions are there. There is a master plan. We know, we've sat on these things. It's there. How then is that going to be implemented?
Rukshan, yes.
Pick up something that Sriyan mentioned, that the animal rights, animal welfare aspect of elephants has taken center stage, where the conservation of wild elephants hasn't actually had the same kind of attention. But you can't expect people who are fighting for the rights of domestic elephants or the welfare of domestic elephants to take up the conservation aspect of wild elephants, because these are two separate groups and lobby groups and interest groups. So animal rights activists will fight for the welfare of domestic elephants, and they actually have right now the sound bites and the unity and strength to push forward. Conservation of wild elephants is initially, primarily the jurisdiction and the job of the Wildlife Department. And they have failed miserably because of the type of policies that they have adopted and the type of management that they practice over the years, perhaps due to political pressure, perhaps due to a lack of real interest in the task that they have been assigned. But conservation organizations also have a role to play. And if conservation organizations are unable to engage the wildlife department or collaborate with them and get this moving, because the research exists to understand what actually needs to be done. And Anjali mentioned a couple of the issues that are really important about outward migration from dry wet areas or seasonal migration into fallow farmlands to find their food. And right throughout Sri Lanka, this crazy fencing, elephant fencing that is used in an ad hoc manner, in a localized manner to address some, not a conservation issue, but elephant depredation on cropland or coming into homesteads or wherever. If you look at the country as a whole and the hundreds or thousands of kilometers of elephant fencing, it's actually preventing the safe movement of elephants into areas that they actually should have access. And that is a huge conservation impact on elephants, because they live, like Anjali mentioned, the majority live outside of protected areas. And there is absolutely no proper management of those populations. So if you go back in time, traditionally, elephants knew how to live around people. And that is why the conflict was low. And people also, traditional people who lived in traditional villages, knew how to and still do know how to live around elephants. It's new settlers under the Mahabali scheme or some other irrigation scheme who have lived in urban environments or in environments that for centuries have had no elephants, that find it the most difficult to live in an elephant landscape where elephants also utilize the land. So this conflict, whether it be leopards or whether it be elephants, they understand how to live with humans. And increasingly in the 21st century, we are coming face to face with them without the capacity to understand how to live with them. And so departments are interfering in the smooth function of coexistence between humans and elephants because of political imperatives. So all these things have now been worked out. Theoretically, we do know what steps we need to take, but practically implementation is at a very primitive stage.
Thank you, Rukshan. I think I'm going to move into the final phase of our discussion, which is actually the theme of the World Wildlife Day this year, which was Partnership for Conservation. We spoke of cohabitation, but when it comes to actually getting things done, I don't know whether partnership is where it should be. Sriyan, how can we partner up, and who should partner up, and how should we do it to conserve?
So I think if we are to accelerate this conversation, firstly, while I love the keystone species and all the attention on the elephants and the leopards, I think Sri Lanka will have to widen the conversation to the broader range of species that are part of this enhanced biodiversity that we talk about. Because if not, there's an entire population of species, especially in the southwestern quadrant of the country, which may lack the presence of the leopard and the elephant and may lose out in the whole equation. So we have to shift this conversation to a better balance so that those species, especially in the rainforest and things like that, can get also heightened. Now, when it comes to these conversations, you have to look at the ecosystem conservation. And, while we can talk about the species conservation, this all comes back to who is protecting ecosystems. And therein lies part of the problems, because we have these boundaries. I mean, we were speaking of elephants earlier. We have the elephants moving between the wildlife department jurisdiction and the forest department. And if we take two philosophies around how to look at them and fence the lands away, saying yours and mine, you impact migration and things like that. So ecosystem conservation, there aren't too many players involved in the country. And also how it's looked at it in Sri Lanka is that, the jurisdiction, if I have a 50-acre land, I have a waterway running through it, and I have some very rare species of, let's say, fish. If I want to do either in situ or ex situ conservation around that, somebody will come and tell me, no. That animal belongs to other people and you have no jurisdiction. But if I were to turn that 50-acre forest land into a cropland, use agrochemicals and cut every tree and sell it, and essentially destroy every species in that 50 acres, nobody would stop me from doing that. So there needs to be a new vision around a actual partnership where private sector players, the right kind of NGOs, WNPSs of this country and people who really care are empowered more to be not equal but more powerful partners in conservation. And private sector parties, plantation companies and other players are encouraged to play bigger roles in conservation if we want the conservation journey to succeed. If you look at, core areas like, let's take healthcare in our country, we have opened up private hospitals and our very life depends on a private hospital. But in conservation, the life and future of our species is left to be controlled by one or two government departments. And I think if you want the true element of partnership to come about in this country's conservation future, a different view of partners of conservation need to be brought in, where more powerful alliances, more democratization of conservation is created in Sri Lanka, so that private conservation areas can be created, private players can come in and say, we are as good and can be as responsible in looking after our plants and species of the future, rather than saying this is a mandate of very few, which often gets then influenced by politics. So rebalancing that partnership conversation would be my biggest input for the future direction if we want to create a different future compared to the last 2-3 decades, which isn't looking that rosy.
And Sriyan, you spoke of the natural ecosystem and looking at it in a holistic way. When you talk of the human ecosystem and the partnership ecosystem, what would be the ideal mix?
It depends, unfortunately, right? Because depending on the ecosystem, depending on the population density, depending on the species density, this conversation will have to change, right? Different players can become stronger components in different ecosystems. So I would say in Sri Lanka, I'm maybe out of my depth in answering this, but I would say one size does not fit all in these different ecosystems. So I think we need to mix and match models. And we must be open to trying out a few things different. If you look at how much of in situ or ex situ conservation initiatives we have run in the last 2-3 decades, absolutely not enough if we are to be responsible custodians for Sri Lanka's future. So I would say broad answers, new models, new public-private partnerships, new private sector initiatives. We are seeing more corporates coming in. We are seeing, for example, WNPS through plant. We have set up spacers and we are partnering people to set up our own private conservation areas, private individual-owned conservation areas. And why can't those be treated with a certain formal recognition of conservation spaces rather than the traditional ones? So I would encourage both government and private sector to find new answers, because the old ones are failing us.
Thank you, Sriyan. Anjali, would you like to weigh in on partnership?
Yeah, so absolutely correct in that sense. I think there is an understanding and a move towards that, and I think it's time now to go with that, to push for that, to flow with that, to have, like other countries have, private protected areas, PPAs. There is legislation for that. IUCN recognizes that. We have introduced that here with some of our corridors for conservation initiatives in the highlands, where we see, especially in the wet zone, Sriyan mentioned this earlier, in the wet zone, a lot of it is plantation landscapes. So the land players there, I would say the stakeholders, I won't say land owners because it's on long-term lease, but still for the short term anyway, the landowners in that sense, or controllers of the land, vast acreages of land, are plantation companies. So they really have to be, center in this if conservation in the wet zone is to be looked at in that sense. I'm hoping that there is that realization now. I mentioned earlier about the shift from just, corporate social responsibility projects here and there to where they are taking it in as part of, the corporate system in their plans. It needs to be done. I think they're realizing if they don't, they're also losing out. It's an economic question here too, right? That solution has to be there. There is definitely, from the plantation sides, partnerships, where we are trying to identify using the leopard as a proxy. And I have to say that, you do cover a whole bunch of small species too. We've got, critically endangered frogs where we've identified, and now it's, actually moved their range from what we knew before. So looking at that from a biodiversity perspective, identifying specific landscapes that are, whether they be, little patches in between or connecting, stepping stones or corridors or buffers are very important. All of these that can be within the larger landscape in the currently outside protected areas. I agree with what was mentioned, that the government, the entities that are responsible or have been given the responsibility for wildlife and wildscapes, why should it be that they are the ones who have to take on all that responsibility? I mean, they don't own the animals or the land. It's a national question here. So I think that is a good way to maybe move forward, to look at how we can think outside the box, move away from the traditional paradigm of only having those protected area systems. Those are 100% necessary, but looking at how then we can have this viable landscape of connection as well. Also, I think it's important, we've realized through years of work now that our traditional view of what a wild landscape is not the reality on the ground. We have wildlife and wild species, from our mega big, big species to our little small, tiny little species that people don't even know and we are not aware of. They live throughout our landscapes, mixed landscapes. Again, I think possibly it's because Sri Lanka has been traditionally able to have agricultural landscapes is not these huge, massive industrial level things. That has allowed for, pockets of this to continue. So we need to realize that we don't have the luxury anymore to think of, forests only, old growth forests only. No. Animals themselves, wildlife themselves are choosing to live across mixed landscapes. And that's fantastic. That's fabulous, because then there is that coexistence. You can manage the land in a certain way. Human species can also benefit from whatever it is that they're using it for, while having wildlife species, ecosystems continuing to survive and be productive.
Thank you, Anjali. Rukshan, what are your thoughts on partnerships for conservation?
To clarify what both of them said, in terms of wild landscapes or protected areas, if you're talking about privatization or private land holdings for conservation, one is not really talking about private buy-ins into national parks, sanctuaries, or forest reserves. You're actually talking about additional land where it could be wilderness land, it could be semi-wild, it could be farmland that is fallow, that is going back into scrub or whatever. These lands can be identified, and like in Africa, where there are private conservancies, these can be made into conservation areas where animals, the wildlife populations within those landscapes can be encouraged to increase, and protection can be afforded. So actually, adds to the conservation landscape of the country. It's not a subdivision or a change in ownership of the government sector managed wilderness lands. And in fact, perhaps then private lands in the future could become an example of how best wilderness land can be managed for conservation. And perhaps then the government can take a cue from that and improve its own management practices and best practices. There is always the threat of people have often seen this wrong because they think that if the government doesn't manage national parks properly or sanctuaries, if they're privatized, they will be fine. They won't, because private enterprise and business imperatives are not always, don't always coincide with conservation priorities. So privatizing what is held as in trust for the people, like a national park, by the government, using the wildlife department as the agency of implementation, has to remain. So I just wanted to clarify that. Just because the management is poor or there are many violations in those national parks doesn't mean that privatization is the answer.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Can I just give an example from what Rukshan was saying? I mean, the fact that it's additional, right? Adding to the existing protected area system, which strengthens it. An example was from some of the work done in Wilpattu. We realized that when you have a hard boundary of a protected area where the buffer is completely, non-existent in a sense, what happens is that protected area itself becomes not as effective as the land size we think is a protected area. So the outer buffer is actually now inside the park. So as a result, wildlife are getting even more cornered in the central core. So even though Wilpattu is our largest protected area, its effective size for landscape conservation is actually much smaller. And we see this with, obviously because we were looking at leopards, but other species too, they are concentrating themselves in the middle of the park. So it's important then that we look at these outer areas, buffers or corridors, going into the wet zone and in the hill country, and with partners such as the plantation companies. An example of what Rukshan even mentioned is having these identified corridors, and they're not really even corridors, it's additional refuges between two larger protected areas that are part and parcel of the government authority of protected area system. This is, Peak Ridge Forest Corridor, something that's an example between two areas that has come about. There is another one, Elbed Ridge Corridor, and this is all coming about because of the plantation companies themselves agreeing that these lands should be often just held as is, where it is, and have some form of additional oversight to it, protection to it, where they agree to not destroy certain areas, the land as is, restore as possible. And we are seeing 3 generations right now. Again, obviously I'm talking about leopard here, but it doesn't mean it's only the leopard, right? We've got 3 generations here of this particular species coming in, but we know that from other biodiversity work, these areas are harboring really, really vital, sometimes critically endangered species. So it's just an example of what Rukshan was talking about, to make people realize that it doesn't mean it's, not the traditional protected areas, it's an add-on to it, and how we can do it thinking differently with multiple partners here.
Thank you, Anjali. Sriyan, you were...
Yeah, I just want to touch a little bit on the economic model, because a lot of these things in conversation don't work if you don't crack the economic model, right? DWC, for example, has a massive mandate, and, we would always be pointing a finger saying, hey, this is not sorted, that is not sorted. While that may be the case, when you sometimes study the economic model, you find the amount of resourcing which is flowing down to that department to address those issues is woefully inadequate. So the moment you have a conversation looking at the economics of what, let's say, the Department of Wildlife is spent, how much money is spent, and then you ask how much money can that actually deliver in terms of what that money can give us as impact, you will begin to understand that that cannot safeguard our conservation interest. So what are the economic models which need to come in? Another example is, unless we accelerate the compensation for crop loss on the farmers, we will never make them partners in the human-elephant cohabitation, coexistence journey. It will always remain human-elephant conflict, because the moment he loses his crop after months of work, if nobody is saying, but that's okay, we understand that, at least we have a safety net for you and the money is in your bank account tomorrow, they will never be comfortable when they see an elephant, even moving through their property. So the economic model, and there are many other examples of economic benefit. I mean, you make a ton of money in Yala, but do you siphon half of that back to the treasury, or does the bulk of it go back into conserving other species in other areas and say that is our economic hub, but the money needs to go back into peripheral conservation, etc., etc. So if the economic models are not given enough attention, both to bring private sector parties in, if you don't look at debt swaps, if you don't look at tax incentives for people who invest in conservation, so if you don't play those games smartly enough, beating the drum on the conservation and the issues and the needs we have. I mean, I'm more from a private sector economic model, business model to conservation perspective. That's my angle on this, and I do know that unless you bring those things correctly into the conservation sphere, conservation on its own has no chance of succeeding. So I think the marriage is key for the next 2-3 decades.
Thank you, Sriyan. Rukshan, you want to weigh?
Adding to what Sriyan said, just over 10 years ago, I think, the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce had a day-long symposium where the Wildlife Department was present, and I think the Forest Department was present, and every stakeholder that they could think of, including Sri Lanka Tourism Authority, anybody who has any kind of interest in wildlife and conservation and tourism related to wildlife was there. And there were many presentations made, both by the department and by the private sector, on actually assessing the value of the wildlife resource of Sri Lanka, and looking specifically at national parks like Vilpattu and Yala. And well, it was an initiative to try to move forward, to try to get Sri Lanka to better utilize Sri Lanka's natural resources in a way that is beneficial to both wildlife and people. But it ended up in a report, as far as I know, and it never went beyond that. So I really don't know what the sticking point is. So what Sriyan says is correct, but I think there are some stumbling blocks that are a bit difficult to anticipate. And though there are a lot of initiatives, they don't seem to go the distance. And we are where we are.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Rukshan. And we've been talking about different kinds of stakeholders. And as my last question, I would like to ask you, what can the general average Sri Lankan, what can we play? What is the role that we should play in conserving, preserving, and really protecting our wildlife? What is your message? Anjali, starting with you.
Okay, so I think that's a big question. It could have multiple answers. I think, like in any sphere, in anything that's acted out, there are multiple actors that have multiple roles, and I think it's important that we all realize that that is necessary. If you look at a surgery, let's take a medical surgery. You're going to have a specialist doctor, you're going to have a generalized doctor, you're going to have nurses, you're going to have attendants, you're going to have pre, post, during operative care, all of that. So there's multiple actors that are tasked with multiple different things that they need to do, because that's what they're geared to do. So in the same way with conservation, since that's what the conversation is about today, I think it's important that science-based scenarios are taken into consideration, that different people, be it the general public, the media, the scientists giving in the data, the government side using that data correctly, general civic society organizations being the bodies that can lobby for certain things, the watchdogs as well. So all of that is required to work in consort if we are actually going to have a proper, long-term, I won't say solution, but more scenario where we can continue to have the kind of wildlife and biodiversity we do on this island.
Rukshan, what is your message to the audience on what the general public can do?
Firstly, I think be aware of the biodiversity and natural resources of your country and appreciate the almost unique situation of Sri Lanka. We are now in the almost past the first quarter of the 21st century. We have got a population of almost 22 million people. We still have several thousand elephants, unknown number of leopards, probably around approximately 1,000. There is a lot of other animals, megafauna, as well as myriad, reptiles, birds, fish, amphibians. Many of them unique to this island, endemics. So, when firstly becoming aware, becoming conscious of the kind of island that you live in, and the kind of activities that are going on in terms of conservation, whether it be government sector, whether it be private sector, organizations that do research, that do conservation, see where you can fit in, and also be a voice, be a lobby for when it's important to have your voice heard as a citizen. And all I can say is increase your personal knowledge of what Sri Lanka is, because Sri Lanka is not Dubai, it's not Singapore, and any development model that we follow should take into account our natural resources, our strengths, and our potential. So that's what I would like to say.
Thank you, Rukshan. Sriyan, your message is?
Thank you, Ravindi. So I think mine would be one of hope. I think there's lots of reasons to be hopeful for. Sri Lanka is still not at all a lost cause. In fact, it's a country which still has an exciting journey on conservation ahead, despite the issues we have, right? So, Anjali spoke of the different roles that, organizations and other players have in this conservation story. In the part of conservation organizations, WNPS would probably be one of the largest, if not the largest. And we have, thousands of different players in that, starting from the small kids to the youth, to the more senior people, to the scientists. So my ask would be, if we are going to keep the journey of hope alive before it becomes too late, more public need to be engaged in conservation in some form or the other. You can simply contribute financially, you can contribute your time, your voice, your writing skills, but become a player and bet for conservation would be my ask. But the common message I want to leave is there is hope, but only if more people become players and participants in the conservation journey. So I would ask that more people take up that role, and of course we will continue to do our part and play our roles. Different actors need to play their roles, but Sri Lanka has a lot that we can be proud of, we can be excited about, and we should fight fiercely to protect them.
Thank you, Sriyan. We've been having a very insightful and informative conversation here, which I'm sure is going to inspire and ignite initiation among all of us. Thank you very much, Anjali, Rukshan, Sriyan, for being here. It was a delight talking to you. And to all our viewers, thank you so much for joining us. Until next time, take care.